Joshua Martin, who is here today to speak from Philomath School District, Oregon's Philomath School District, to speak to us about cybersecurity for nearly $0. Joshua, are you ready?
I am.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see here. How do I get this? Oh, there we go. Hello. Can everyone hear me? So again, my name is Joshua Martin. I am the system administrator for Philomath School District, although I would argue that title is not at all an accurate reflection of my duties, and I am here to talk about cybersecurity. Though I don't have enough time to cover everything I would like, I am going to talk very quickly about my experience at Philomath over the past 3 years and all the things I've learned that are either counterintuitive, not well known, and counterintuitive or not well known. Some is low-hanging fruit, you all should know, but just haven't gotten around to doing. I've chosen to structure this presentation from the starting position of absolute rock bottom, a position most in K-12 understand very well. So what exactly do I mean by rock bottom? A bit of backstory. I was hired at Philomath School District in 2022. We have around 1,600 students, 200 or so staff, and an IT department of 4. On the facilities manager's desk sat a Dell Tower server upon which ran the controller software for our district's HVAC system. His office is generally left unlocked. The hardware was from 2010. The OS was Windows Server 2008, for which extended support ended in 2020. Nothing was encrypted. It was not domain joined, which was probably for the best. The only account was the default local administrator account. The password was 1234. The firewall was disabled. There was no antivirus or EDR. There was no monitoring or alerts of any kind. There were no backups. There were undocumented third-party contractors with 24/7 remote access via LogMe and something or other. And it was, of course, also on the same VLAN as all the other servers. The rest of the district was not much better. To me, this was immediately terrifying. I'm sure you'll all agree. But what's even more terrifying is that to your average small school district, this is a typical Tuesday. Which of course explains why we've been among the top targets for cybercrime for a number of years now. So not long after I was hired, our district partnered up with LBL ESD. Thanks again, guys. Are you in here? Ah, yeah, they're way in the back. And we set up a Tenable Nessus server. LBL began scanning our Windows systems for vulnerabilities and issuing weekly reports. Our first report was 35 pages long and contained 85 vulnerabilities, 15 of which were considered critical with a CVSS of 10 or nearly 10. We then worked with them to complete a cybersecurity assessment via S2.org. This is where they quiz and score you based on things like, do all your staff have MFA on their email accounts? It's pretty comprehensive and takes quite a while to complete. This reads like a credit score. Minimum is 500, max is 850. When we did our first evaluation near the end of 2022, I had already made a lot of changes to improve things, but we scored 596, just below fair. So when I first got started, we literally were at ground zero. So step 1 was accounts. You can't access anything if you can't access anything, right? So I started collecting info. First was all the admin accounts the department used. Even if I didn't know what it was used for or what the passwords were, I would leave columns blank. Second was a list of all the apps and services we use, how and where admin log in, how regular users log in, account provisioning, and SSO. It's important to note this was not done in one shot. It was done continuously as I encountered things in the course of my regular duties. Every scrap of info I came across, however incomplete, got dumped somewhere. Rather than leaving all the logins on spreadsheets, I set to work finding a suitable place to store them that was secure, flexible, and would allow sharing credentials easily, as well as managing permissions in tiers. Bitwarden fit the bill. Everything is encrypted correctly. They've never been compromised, and I won't get into it here, but they've definitely done their homework security-wise. They have clients for Android, iOS, Windows, Mac, and Linux, as well as browser extensions for Chrome and Firefox. Basic accounts are free, but if you want fancy stuff like single sign-on, org management, or storing MFA codes, you need the paid version, which is $5 a month a user, or you could do what I did, spin up a Vault Warden server in Docker, put it behind Nginx, and call it a day. Vault Warden is a locally hosted 100% compatible backend for Bitwarden written in Rust that unlocks most of the fancy features. Now we have a decent inventory of all the logins and what they do. What are our goals? I sat down and came up with a unified approach to accounts that should work across the board. Then I set up each system as close to my vision as possible. For each system, we want a break glass generic superadmin with all the permissions. These are only to be used as a last resort, obviously. We want one account per system, one system per account, be it superadmin or service account. We want MFA everywhere feasible. We want account names that immediately identify their purpose. We want single sign-on for everyone but the superadmin, since the superadmin account is what we use when SSO breaks. We want strong documented passwords, passphrases if they'll be entered by humans, and those should all be at least 32 characters, preferably 64. We want least privilege necessary, except for the superadmin, of course, and we want 0 shared staff accounts at all for accountability reasons. So I started with the super admin accounts. For web services, everyone is different, but setting up a super admin account without SSO, enabling MFA via TOTP, and storing it in Bitwarden was generally no big deal. For Windows servers, what we ended up doing was setting the local administrator account password to a very long, randomly generated passphrase, printing it out, and storing it in a safe. For Linux servers, it was the same deal, but with the root account. What about workstations? If you aren't familiar, LAPS, or Local Administrator Password Solution, changes the local administrator password on machines to random values periodically or on demand and stores them in Active Directory. But don't fall into the LAPS trap. There are two versions of LAPS. One is called Microsoft LAPS and involves deploying an MSI file to all your workstations. It is deprecated. The other is newer, called Windows LAPS, is built into Windows 10 and 11. You literally just have to create a GPO and run a few commands on a domain controller to extend the AD schema so you can see the passwords in a LAPS tab when you look at the properties of a computer object in Active Directory users and computers. There are plenty of guides out there on setting this up. Just know if it mentions anything about an MSI file, it is completely useless. So what about IT admin accounts, the ones we use every day? Well, Active Directory sucks in a lot of ways. For example, you don't want domain admins to even have the ability to log into a workstation. Otherwise, anyone who has administrator access to that workstation can potentially use those other credentials to move around in your domain. I created separate domain, server, and workstation admin accounts for each person in the tech department, then created two new groups called server admins and workstation admins, because domain admins is already a thing, and applied GPOs so that each account type may only log on to the relevant machines. I also bullied everyone into having separate admin accounts for Google Workspace and Microsoft Entra. Now, those Windows admin accounts aren't stored in Bitwarden, mostly because there is no technical way Bitwarden could autofill a regular Windows login the way it can in the browser. Thankfully, there's OnlyKey. This is an open source device that is encrypted with a 10-digit PIN. Each button can be short or long pressed, and it can type whatever you store in there. So, long pressing button 2 might type my domain admin username, then press tab, then type the password, and then hit enter. It can also do TOTP codes like Google Authenticator and do FIDO2/U2F auth like a YubiKey. They can also sort SSH certs. These are $70 each. There's no web dependencies, no subscription required. You will need a Windows or Linux machine on which to run the configuration software, but after configuration, it shows up like a regular USB keyboard. Now, with admin accounts out of the way, next were service accounts, which are handled a bit differently. These were the paperclips and duct tape holding together our house of cards. In our case, I had service accounts in Active Directory and Google. I started with Active Directory. Using the last modified and last login timestamps gave me a pretty good beat on which were unused. Most of them were unused. I also worked backwards. Anytime I was logged into a service, say the help desk, and I saw a section for an LDAP connection, I'd make sure the account it was using made sense. If necessary, I would create a new clearly named one and document that in Bitwarden. Let's see. Now, there are a lot of generic accounts the tech department uses that require an email inbox, either for alerts or for initial account signup or MFA codes, etc. Some of them, like Adobe, require that you use SSO to log into their service directly with a Google account with appropriate privileges. In cases like that, we needed a dedicated Google account. But in many other cases, we simply needed a place to land an email. So instead of a dedicated Google user and all the security implications there, we could make a Google group for each login, but that becomes pretty difficult to manage as well. So instead, I created just a few tiered groups, e.g. Tech Admin, Tech Level 1, Tech Level 2, and added email addresses as appropriate to these accounts that correspond to logins on other sites. So now, when we go to log into Canvas using the canvas.admin account alerts go to the IT admin group, and we don't have a billion separate logins to manage. Now, we made the decision pretty early on to kill generic staff accounts and make sure basically everyone outside of the tech department was using their own assigned account for their job duties. Substitutes, student teachers, volunteers, etc. get an account on a separate domain that immediately identifies them as not being an official staff member. With lower grade students, we set up ClassLink quick cards to make it easier for them to log into their own accounts, so we could eliminate the shared room whatever logins they were using for the lower grades at the time. Now, even after much effort and many emails, there were a few lingering accounts I just wasn't sure about. I waited for a time where I knew there'd be minimal blowback, disabled the account, and if someone screamed, I got my answer. I re-enabled the account, and I documented what it did. Now, in 2022, we got word that our insurance would require MFA for all staff email accounts. For a variety of reasons, but mostly because it's free, we settled on using Google's built-in MFA the same way we do for admin accounts, although we encouraged staff to use SMS and provided a YubiKey if they refused. Those are about $25 each, but we only had to give out a handful. I then configured basically everything to use Google for SSO. There is one big disadvantage to this method, though. For this to work, each of our 200 plus staff members would have to log on individually and enable MFA all on their own. I sent out periodic emails with graphic guides explaining what MFA was, why it was necessary, and why staff shouldn't fret over using their phones. I was blunt with everyone and made it clear what was fact and what was my personal opinion. We were at 100% adoption 6 months ahead of schedule. On the note of MFA, we needed a tool for remote access, but it had to be MFA protected. It can be difficult to add MFA to a VPN, and we found Jump Host to be more useful anyway, so we landed on Mesh Central. This is a free open source web-based app that allows remote desktop access to machines on your network via an agent, as well as via RDP, VNC, or CLI access via SSH. It was developed primarily by an engineer from Intel. We installed the agent on all our Windows servers. We can enforce MFA, and we can now limit contractors to specific rights on specific machines, e.g. the HVAC server. We also push the agent out to workstations, and our techs use it for remote assistance. We actually took this a step further and completely disabled RDP via GPO and firewall rules. This means the only means of accessing our Windows servers is via Mesh Central or the Proxmox UI, both of which have mandatory MFA. For the Linux machines, which are all headless, we went with password-protected key-only SSH, which may or may not count as MFA depending on who you ask, but it's a lot better than plain username and password. All right, enough about MFA. Let's talk about groups. Mailing and security groups have been the single most miserable project I've had to tackle at Philomath. There is a history before my time of folks being sent sensitive info they should not have been privy to due to incorrect group membership. There was no actual group structure or naming conventions. Groups were ad hoc and membership was manual. Not cool. It took a while to compile everything, but the info we need to make groups is based on location or department, as well as job duties, union membership, student services programs, and a few special cases. And when you multiply the number of locations by everything else, you end up with several hundred groups, far more groups than we even have employees. Still, I am of the mind that with regard to staff, since these are hierarchical, more groups is better than fewer as long as they are accurate. We can always combine them later. How can we make this not a complete nightmare? Scripting. Also, there are a few shortcuts. So it all starts in Active Directory. Location can be derived from OU of the account. Position goes in the job title field. Special programs go in the office field. Union membership can be derived from position, e.g. all teachers are in the PEA union. That can then be dumped into the employee type field. And that's all the info we need. So to create new accounts, we run the account creation PowerShell script, which forces all these fields to be valid and checks for any conflicts. We have a second PowerShell script that runs nightly or on demand that looks at this info and adds everyone to the correct groups, among many, many other things. And yes, it is nearly 1,000 lines long. I should probably split that up. So those groups are then synced to Google Workspace via Google Cloud Directory Sync, and now when a staff member needs to send an email or share a document with an oddly ragtag group of staff members, they can just start typing approximately who they want, and it shows up. Now, what can you do with 500 million very specific groups? I'm glad you asked. On Windows, each group gets their own folder on a shared drive. Folders are created and permissions applied automatically via a PowerShell script. Access-based enumeration means they only see the folders they have access to. In Google, each group is assigned their own shared drive. Those groups and the resolution they provide are also handy when they sync via LDAP to our phone system and our access control door system. Now, obviously, we use PowerShell to script things involving Active Directory. What about Google? GAM, or GAM7, as it's now called. This isn't much to look at. It's basically a CLI interface to Google's API. It guides you through the authorization process, which includes creating a Google Cloud project. We have it running on a dedicated Debian VM, but it does work on Windows. GAM is a godsend for security automation. Here's a few things I have it set up to do in that list there. Let's see. There's an example on the right of kind of what the syntax looks like. If you use Google Workspace at all, I highly recommend you take a crack at GAM. Now let's talk about hardware. Oftentimes our attempts to save money on hardware actually made us more secure overall. So this summer, with the impending death of Windows 10 looming, a laptop fresh was kind of inescapable. We could not afford that. So we bought staff Chromebooks instead and made sure nearly everything they need to do will work. Some staff still needed Windows machines, so to have a more seamless experience, we tested GCPW, but it doesn't support hardware auth on Windows, which made it a no-go. As a compromise, we don't issue Windows laptops at all. All Windows machines stay on the district network, and for the few who need Windows apps on the go, we set up Chrome Remote Desktop, which is free and works very well. So now nearly all of our workstations are MFA protected, at least when they're off-site. Our staff also needed replacements for their 10,000-year-old smart boards. We settled on new line C-Series panels as they're fully Chrome OS compatible and far cheaper than the ClearTouch displays with the built-in PC we had previously purchased. What does this have to do with cybersecurity? Well, because they don't have built-in computers, we were able to eliminate about 100 endpoints. No updates, no firewall to manage, no licenses. They're just a big dumb touchscreen TV. Now, on the network side of things, we'd completed changing our IP addressing schema and switching to a much more comprehensive set of per-site VLANs. We had also just swapped in our new line-wise filter appliance, and all was well. Licensing was coming due for both our Cisco core switches and our Meraki firewall, so we planned to switch out both to save some money. What we didn't realize was that the Unify switch we bought only supported a max of 64 VLANs on layer 3. And since we just restructured and had some 200 VLANs, this meant that all layer 3 traffic now has to be piped all the way to the firewall through the filter appliance. One big problem, I have no intention of building all this in our Meraki firewall just to replace it and start over a few weeks later. So for the firewall portion, I set up a virtual machine. Well, more accurately, I set up a Proxmox cluster running OpenSense as a virtual machine in a configuration like this. For those who don't know, OpenSense is a free open source firewall appliance based on FreeBSD. In our case, it runs on 2 mini PCs with a Raspberry Pi there to provide quorum. Each WAN connection first hits an unmanaged dumb switch, then connects to both Proxmox hosts where it is passed through to the OpenSense VM. This has the advantage of being very cheap, like a few $100s. It gives us a hardware-agnostic firewall we can make complete backups of, gives us hardware failover, WAN failover, and centralizes almost all L3 management stuff, giving us view and control of all inter VLAN traffic in one place. OpenSense is pretty cool. The web UI supports MFA and SSO, and everything you would ever want to configure can be done through the web UI. I've had to touch the CLI maybe one time. It really is a professional-grade product, and they do sell real hardware with support for very reasonable prices, if you're into that kind of thing. It has a ton of features out of the box, and for just about everything else, there's a plugin available. But probably the coolest bit is the inclusion of IDS and IPS functionality via Suricata and CrowdSec. Suricata is a more mature service, I'd say, built on lists. A ton of good ones are included for free and are updated automatically. It's a very plug and play. CrowdSec is a bit more modern. It uses crowdsourced data to make determinations and has its own web dashboard. Core functionality in CrowdSec is free. Some advanced stuff costs money. It can take a bit of dialing in. These two work great in tandem, with Suricata catching the low-hanging fruit and CrowdSec catching the more novel stuff. Some other changes we made out of desperation. We switched our hypervisor from VMware to Proxmox. Our NOS needed replacing, so we bought a server from a small vendor and we put TrueNOS on it. We replaced our CUCM phone system with free PBX and we bought cheap phones. We replaced our camera system with ZoneMinder. All of these are free open source products. All of this saved a lot of money on hardware and licensing and gave us a ton of freedom, but again, what does this have to do with cybersecurity? No need to actually raise your hands, but in your head, how many of you have EDR running on your NOS or your SAN? How about your phone system? Camera system? Hypervisor? All of ours are Debian-based. We run CrowdStrike on all of them. This also means that a lot of miscellaneous apps and configs I use for Linux security can be run on systems that would normally be somewhat of a black box. That includes fail-to-ban, which blocks IP addresses upon repeated authentication attempts, and UFW, a very easy and powerful CLI host firewall. Now, we love reusing old servers and old hardware, but they can be left vulnerable when support disappears, obviously, so this is more or less my plan to make old hardware a bit more secure. First, I upgrade the firmware on everything to the latest version, including printers and cameras. We had a Dell FX2S that was our main cluster for a while that needed dozens of different firmware upgrades for the NICs, the chassis, the drives, everything. It was obnoxious, but afterwards it performed a lot more reliably. I reset the BIOS. Who knows what weird stuff was going on with the previous owner, especially if that was you. I actually set the BIOS passwords, at least the admin password. If it has any remote management like Intel AMT, I will enable it, set a password, assign that to a specific NIC, and then disable it again. And I don't use that NIC for anything. I do this on all of our new servers as well. It seems like all of the built-in remote management tools have horrendous vulnerabilities pop up on the regular, and I don't trust any of them. I will disable any unused protocols. So on printers, like the screenshot there are like 30 protocols enabled by default. You might use 2 of them. I will apply OS level mitigations, patches, whatever, fixes for things like Spectre. Often these are bundled into the OS, and you don't have to do anything, but a bit of Googling for your generation of your hardware will help. And finally, a lot of vulnerabilities can be mitigated completely by just disabling hyperthreading. And modern hypervisors like Proxmox are so good at spreading things around that I haven't even noticed a performance hit in doing so. So as far as backups go, here's the configuration I settled on. We have a server, it's nothing special. It has 12 3.5-inch drive bays. On it runs Proxmox as well as virtual machines for our backups. Each VM is given a few hard drives via hardware pass-through. Those are then used as a ZFS mirror. 2 virtual machines are for Cube backup, one for Google Workspace, one for Microsoft 365. They pull all the data for users as well as shared drives, etc. from the cloud, encrypt it, deduplicate, and store on their drives. The third virtual machine runs Proxmox Backup Server. This pulls in snapshots for all of the virtual machines running on all the other Proxmox hosts. Backups are encrypted before they are sent to PBS, and the encryption keys are on a flash drive in a safe and nowhere else. Every night it replicates to 2 other servers in other physical locations across the district. Those servers are old desktop machines running PBS with a few refurbished drives from Amazon. The admin password for these servers is on paper, in the safe, and nowhere else. At night, the PBS server also replicates to Wasabi S3 storage. We've enabled immutability for 30 days there. Our TrueNAS server stores everything in a ZFS mirror and can tolerate up to 12 disk failures. It takes daily ZFS snapshots, and we can restore individual files. It replicates all user profile and shared drive data from the Windows side to an old Dell R720 server we had lying around full of refurbished drives, also in a ZFS mirror. When the TrueNAS backup server encrypts and syncs all that data to Wasabi in the cloud, then the TrueNAS backup server encrypts and syncs all that data to Wasabi in the cloud, where it is also held immutable for 30 days. Now let's talk about storage for a second. We buy refurbished hard drives, especially for backups. Why? Part of it is the bathtub curve. Hard drives are most likely to fail when they are brand new and when they are very old. What that curve looks like exactly depends on a lot of factors, but used drives, assuming they are not completely thrashed, are generally less prone to near-term failure than new drives because they've effectively already been vetted. Refurbished drives often come from the manufacturer with the same warranty as new drives, despite being significantly cheaper, meaning I can buy 2 or more, set up a ZFS mirror or RAID 1, and suddenly the likelihood of losing all that data drops to near zero. So what does our backup system break down to as far as cost goes? So taking into account repurposed hardware, about $3,000. Wasabi charges $7, I think, per terabyte per month for active and deleted storage, so our average bill comes to about $250 a month. Couple that with Cube Backup, that means our annual costs, not including electricity, are under $5,000. The entire thing is automated, everything is backed up nightly, all of it is encrypted in motion and at rest, cloud backups are immutable, everywhere data is stored physically can withstand up to 50% drive failure, although over the past 2.5 years we've had 0 drives fail. Everything is deduplicated and everything is stored in triplicate at a minimum. So if anybody here can beat that at that cost, I would love to hear it. All right, enough about hardware. Let's talk about tools, tips, tricks, etc. It wouldn't be a cybersecurity presentation if I didn't talk about group policy. I don't have time to talk about everything, but if you have a giant default domain policy filled with random junk like I did, please break it up into a bunch of smaller GPOs that are labeled logically. Same with default domain controllers policy. Check to make sure the GPO setting you are looking at actually does something and applies to modern versions of Windows, not just Windows Server 2003. And then you can use the dcgpo fixed command to restore the defaults for both of those GPOs. Then make sure your new separated GPO are set to enforced, so they override the new default GPO. In doing so, you change basically nothing as far as the user experience goes, but you have a much cleaner, more obvious base on which to work. Also, it gets a lot of hate, mostly from people with messy group policy, but loopback policy processing is great. It basically makes it so that when you apply user policies to an OU full of computers, those policies, instead of doing absolutely nothing, apply to any user who logs onto those machines. Now, there are also security baselines available for group policy via the Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit. It's amazing how many people don't know about this. This will give you access to a bunch of installable GPOs with Microsoft's recommended security settings. Why these don't just ship with Windows Server, I do not know, but it is shocking how many people are not aware. Download them, install them, poke around with them, apply them as appropriate. Like before, don't edit them, just create a new GPO and override anything you don't like. All right, in the Windows Server ecosystem, there are a ton of protocols and ciphers you should probably kill. There are other things where you should be enabling and enforcing encryption, signing, etc. There are specific implications for each of these, and I don't have time to get into all of them, but generally they require a GPO and or some firewall rules. LLMNR, MDNS, WINS, and NetBIOS all exist as workarounds and or primitive versions of DNS. Disabling them probably won't break anything unless you're running some very old systems. LLDP doesn't seem to see much use from what I've seen outside of IP phones. LM and NTLM are forms of auth for LDAP that should absolutely be disabled, and unless you have legacy Windows around, disabling it shouldn't really be an issue. Now, disabling RC4 can get a bit complicated if your AD has been around a long time, but it's a vulnerable cipher used with Kerberos. AES is the more modern alternative. Now, as far as LDAP, plain text LDAP is in pretty heavy use, or was in pretty heavy use for us with non-Windows devices like scanners. By default, it's in plain text, which is obviously bad. We have banished plain LDAP completely and are only using encrypted LDAP now. So to use LDAPs, you usually have to change the port, maybe check the box for SSL. Then unless you disable certificate verification altogether, which you definitely don't want to do, you'll also need to trust your domain controller certificate. On something like a scanner or MFP, you'll need to manually export and then import the cert using the web UI. This bit of bash here is something we use for our Debian-based systems. It pulls the cert automatically from a domain controller, adds it to the local store, and updates the local store. We actually have the plain LDAP port 389 blocked across the whole domain. Now, speaking of certificates, there's this very underrated tool called XCA, which is free and open source, can import basically any kind of certificate, authority, key, CSR, or CRL. It will then connect the dots between them for you automatically, save it all into an encrypted database file, and allow you to export them in whatever format you want. When you arrive at your new job and have a mishmash folder of hundreds of random PEM and cert files, this is a godsend. All right, so HTTPS, even with self-signed certs, is better than plain text HTTP. For us, anything that has a web UI doesn't get a cert automatically from our Windows ADCS server and would be cumbersome to put behind a reverse proxy, instead gets a cert signed by OpenSense. That includes things like Proxmox, but also printers, IP cameras, whatever. We created a certificate authority certificate in OpenSense. Then we trust that CA cert in the browser or the OS manually or via GPO. And then for each server, we can create a server certificate using that authority. You can even set it to expire in like 10 years. We upload that server certificate to whatever thing has a web UI. And now the browser will trust it. And if we see something like your connection is not private error, we know something is funky. Someone's trying to man in the middle us. We don't block port 80 though, since a lot of things use port 80 to redirect to HTTPS. Is this perfect? No, but it's minimal effort. It's only for internal stuff, and it's much better than plain HTTP all over the place. Now, versions of TLS and SSL older than TLS 1.2 are not secure and need to be disabled. There are also insecure ciphers and hashes you need to disable. There's a tool for that called IIS Crypto, if you haven't heard of it already. You run this on Windows Server. You select which protocols, ciphers, and hashes to enable or disable, and it applies the settings via registry entries. We actually converted our registry entries into a GPO, so we don't use this tool directly anymore. There are templates included. We've applied the strict template on all of our servers, and nothing broke, but your mileage may vary. For digging into Active Directory vulnerabilities, we also have a few free tools, namely Ping Castle and Purple Knight. Both of these tools are free to download. They run against Active Directory and give you a score and a report. I will periodically run through a report, cross-reference with our Nessus scan, Google each issue, see if it's worth fixing and what might break, and make a plan. Now, what about the cloud? There are two free tools, Scuba Gear and Scuba Goggles. Both are developed by CISA and are available on GitHub. They work similarly to Ping Castle and Purple Knight, but they scan Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace respectively for compliance with CISA's recommendations. What about patching? For Windows, Action 1. This saved my life. It is cloud-based with an agent. It's 100% free for up to 200 endpoints with no feature limits. We run it on all our servers, and now that we have far fewer Windows machines, we run it on our workstations as well. It even has a repository of third-party software it will keep up to date. You can configure schedules, auto-approve updates, configure update rings, all the good stuff. And sometime soon they'll be releasing a Linux agent, which I am really excited about. All right, so a bit of a change of pace here. I'd like to talk about possibly the most important lesson I've learned. Cybersecurity is more about people than maybe anything else. The goal of cybersecurity is to prevent problems, and there are a number of ways to classify cybersecurity problems. For example, we all know about the three InfoSec pillars, right? CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. There are some broad technical solutions that help prevent, or in some cases recover from, failures in all three of these, including my favorite, the principle of least privilege. But security really is largely a people problem because people are almost always the cause of the worst cybersecurity incidents. I've split people here into three-ish categories for simplicity. They should be self-explanatory. While broad technical solutions like the principle of least privilege do help with broad people problems, there is no 100% effective solution. So people in all three categories can, in theory, find a way around any kind of fence you may build, even if it's just by accident. Now, there are, as far as I can tell, 5 common ways people can screw stuff up. These are, again, mostly self-explanatory, so for the sake of time, I won't go over them, but they categorize the motivation behind the person who caused the problem. This is sort of the mental model I use to classify incidents involving people. It's just an example. Yours will be different. If you have actual bad guys trying to attack you from the inside, it's no longer just a cybersecurity problem. Most common sense security practices will help defend you from this to some degree, but do yourself a favor and don't make this the center of your threat model. We'll get to that in a minute. In the event of an incident, the question you need to ask yourself is this incident evidence that I cannot trust this person? Repeated problems are a helpful indicator, but even so, the answer is often no. Either it's a perfectly reasonable mistake, or it's the result of a systemic problem outside of the person themselves. And without getting into specifics, when there is an incident involving a person, I apply a technical remediation if necessary. I speak to them, figure out why they made the mistake, explain to them why it may cause an issue, thank them for letting me know they made a mistake, send out an email letting everyone know not to do that. Then, if necessary, I add some guardrails to make it harder to do in the future. That process simply does not work unless we trust each other. The bottom line is, having an environment where human trust is paramount will likely do a better job preventing and/or remediating cybersecurity incidents than any technical solution you will ever be able to come up with short of cutting the power. Now, there are a number of primary ways people, especially leaders, royally F this up. One is the belief that every incident, no matter how small, must be prevented through some kind of policy change, which forces an entire organization into stupid gymnastics exercises instead of just accepting a perfectly reasonable risk. Second, people will often allow a clear trust violation and let something slide since technically nothing bad happened, which is a bit like when someone tries to shoot you, misses repeatedly until they run out of bullets, but you still hang out with them because they only hit the dumpster behind you. On the other hand, people sometimes make simple, honest mistakes that can have severe, unforeseen consequences. Leaders then feel pressure to punish them equally severely, publicly chastise them, or reduce their privileges. This is wrong. It violates team trust, and it may cause other staff to attempt to cover up their mistakes out of fear, often making problems worse in the process. And number 4, often in cybersecurity, we get caught up in making it as difficult as possible to do the wrong thing. There's probably a number of you in here thinking, yes, that is what cybersecurity is. Did it break? Oh, good. Okay. Nope. This cable is really stiff, so it's at a pretty harsh angle. Stay. There we go. There's probably a number of you in here thinking, yes, that's what cybersecurity is. But what we tend to forget about, and it's equally important, if not more so, is working to make the correct thing to do the easiest thing to do. This is real life. Your goal is not to stop a Russian hacker pretending to be a janitor. Your goal is to help your neighbor aim at the target instead of their foot. On that note, how do we make the right thing to do the easiest thing to do? Well, it all starts with the help desk. People hate using help desks, including me, because they suck. Most of them are terrible. And often the problem is not the product itself, it's the configuration. And I suspect that's often deliberate. We switched our help desk from SolarWinds to Zamad. Zamad is, you guessed it, free and open source and runs on Debian, although they do have paid support and hosting options. More importantly, it's really, really good. I set up SSO via Google, so logging in is one click like almost everything else. The UI is super simple. The ticket creation workflow is completely customizable. We've got it down as simple as we possibly can. Just as importantly as Zamad's help desk features, it has a built-in knowledge base with a search function. This can be accessed from anywhere in the world, and staff don't even need to be logged in. When a common question comes in, we take a few screenshots and make a new guide. What does a help desk and knowledge base have to do with cybersecurity? Staff are much less likely to do something stupid because the info they need is easily accessible. They're also more likely to report problems since the process is so easy. Now, everyone knows documentation can be incredibly time-consuming, but it doesn't have to be. So Bookstack is what we now use for internal IT documentation. It's a free open source app that runs in Docker. It works a bit like SharePoint. You have shelves, books, chapters, and pages. You can add images, do code formatting, attach files, etc. When I finally spun up a Bookstack server, I put all my scattered documentation and screenshots together in here quite haphazardly. And in many cases, I had pages where the only parts of a process that were documented were areas where I ran into problems. Those docs have saved me several times. It doesn't have to be perfect, you can always refine things later, but just having the important info somewhere so you aren't reinventing the wheel every time will help prevent a lot of problems. Now, anything you do to improve cybersecurity that doesn't cost anything directly will at least cost someone's time. And in the case of open source, you're largely delegating to volunteers. On that note, there are two things we discovered very quickly for which there are no good free commercial options, and they also cannot be reasonably DIY'd. One is antivirus. Free antivirus is crap and doesn't satisfy insurance requirements. The open source DIY solution here would be setting up a Waze server and creating a completely customized SIM XDR thing. Do you have thousands upon thousands of hours and a dedicated team to manage that? I don't. As I said before, we use CrowdStrike. The pricing is reasonable, and outside of that one incident that we don't talk about, it's performed very well. Now, number 2 is web filtering. Bark offers a free web filter for K-12, but it's very limited. You don't get any granularity of configuration based on student grade, etc. Everyone gets the same filter. Free open source solutions include basically rolling your own DNS-based thing, which quickly becomes an absolute nightmare. For filtering, we use Linewise, as the pricing for all the major options seems somewhat comparable, but Linewise seems to have the best feature set, and it's been great for us. Point being, basically anything where the ground is changing swiftly and you need a ton of input data and analysis to get anywhere, you'll want to delegate, and you'll have to pay to do so. All right, and my final tip, label things. Buy a label maker, use it. That's it. I don't have to teach anyone which cable is the primary uplink and which are unused. I don't have to document which drive bay is passed through to which VM because they're all labeled. So where does that leave us now? Well, all the changes we've made are a bit hard to quantify directly, but as of last month, our S2 score was 774, 6 points under excellent. Our most recent vulnerability report only has a handful of items, and we were able to resolve that HVAC server issue. It cost us $10,000 to set up a proper virtual machine on a supported version of Windows, and it'll cost us another probably $250,000 to replace that VM and all the hardware controllers in January of 2027 when Server 2016 extended updates end. Vendor lock-in is bad. But we should have no problem affording this and a ton of other improvements because we have saved so much money in other areas. By my math, close to $500,000 over the past 2 years. And that is all I have. Thank you very much. So many words. I think we have about...
Now into networking time before the next general session.
Are we?
But if you want to hang out for a minute and
Yes.
question or two.
I'm happy to answer questions. Yes.
I just want to say I've been building something very much like this as a presentation, so thank you. This is great.
Huh?
The question I have is, my organization would balk at every single one of these possible ideas because of support matrices for example, being on call 24/7. So do you have any advice for getting organizational acceptance for the scary, free, open source Proxmox, for example?
Well, I mean, Proxmox is an interesting example because they do provide support, but it's not great, and they're on European time.
Exactly.
There are, again, third-party vendors who can help with that. But no, that's kind of the hard mountain to overcome. Our team is 4 people, so even though I'm not on call, I'm on call. I'm in their weekends all the time, middle of the night, whatever. And that's why it works for us as a small organization. If you're a little bit larger, some of this stuff might be outside of your risk tolerance, and I don't have a good solution for that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Similar question. There's a lot of fear of leadership and organizations for having open source because of the specialty that a staff member may be able to bring that service up into existence, but then they leave,
Right.
and then documentation and so on and so forth. Like, I'm sure you can fill in the blanks with my question here, but how do
I know
you
what you're getting at.
overcome that?
So, what the comparison I've always used is when something goes horribly wrong with a Windows server, how many times have you guys reached out to Microsoft support for that? Maybe a couple of you, maybe once or twice, but like it's awful. Like Microsoft support is a joke. It's basically non-existent. So what we rely on is both the official documentation and the and Reddit threads and Spiceworks and XDA and whatever else. It's not any different. And in fact, the open source stuff tends to be better documented because it's more stable. Most of it's on a Debian base, and Debian is completely ubiquitous. Linux itself is completely ubiquitous. So how you would phrase that argument into something you would set in front of a board or something along those lines, I'm not sure. But I haven't had any issues with teaching our Tech 1 and our Tech 2 some pretty advanced stuff that they definitely have never touched before in VMware or any of the other platforms. Does that answer your question?
Basically, yes. It's kind of like, I think it's just a hard sell, unfortunately, because of the fear of people leaving. Because in the IT world right now, there's a lot of rotation
Right.
of staff. And I think there's a fear of administration watching someone spin something up that is potentially money-saving and excellent for an organization, but then to have
The bulk of the things that we've switched to that are open source are download ISO, install the ISO on a machine or a virtual machine, and then click through a web UI. That's it. My boss, for example, Mark Neville, the IT director, he's not here, but he is very much a VMware guy, and he had zero problems adjusting to Proxmox. Even the more advanced stuff, the networking, the ZFS, the pass-through and stuff. How you're going to convince your leadership about that, I'm not totally sure. We're very fortunate in that our boards and our superintendent fully have our back, and they're like, do whatever you need to do because we don't have any money. So if you can make your organization more poor to where they have no choice. Well, and I guess that's the other argument is when your VMware bill comes in, we could pay someone an entire salary with benefits to just be a full-time Proxmox person. So, what do you want? That's a good point.
And vendors, they pull the rug. I mean, he's talking about losing support for Windows Server 2016 when what are you going to move to? Windows Server 2019 or?
I'm not even sure.
And then Microsoft will pull the rug out.
We're gonna try to do a backdoor upgrade to 2019 with the existing one and hope that it works. But last time we tried,
I've been there.
The-
Yeah, I've done this quite a few times.
last time our HVAC
There's some sort of optics around.
server software that got obliterated and we had to start over. And yeah, sorry, did you have a question?
Just a quick question.
Sure.
It was a really great presentation. A lot of really cool tools. When I got started, my organization used a bunch of free tools, and it was really, really great. We can now afford more expensive tools. But my question is how did you plan the maintenance period and upkeep of these systems so that you would maintain that they were going to be the same for you over the time that you're using them?
So, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
So it's a great set of tools that you've implemented, a lot of changes that you've implemented in the place that you're working. What kind of future planning do you have to maintain those systems to make? Because I mean, a lot of it's open source, a lot is going to need continuous improvement, continuous checking and management of your teams. I mean, you can set it up in the beginning of automation, but it's not going to maintain itself. And if it's a small team before, like you were saying, how are you managing this?
Well, I mean, like I said, most of these are ISOs that are distributed with the intention of being somewhat of an appliance. We have the official documentation. I've created documentation for the more hairy bits, but the reality is we've gone through several version upgrades on all of these, and it's really just click through the thing. Like, it's not complicated. Upgrading VMware was way more difficult, and tracking down the ISOs for the Cisco specific drivers from their website and all the licensing and all that garbage. We don't have an official plan because we have, 4 people, so it's just kind of winging it. But to answer your question, we haven't had problems in that regard.
It sounds like part in the question there too maybe is like how do you establish your patch and upgrade cycles and allocate time for that. So like you've put together a suite of things using a bunch of different tools that you might spend $500,000 paying Microsoft for in a more cohesive and automated fashion. You don't have to do as much patching for between all the individual components. So potentially, like, you have a lot of things to apply patches to. And I think maybe is the question just like, what is your patch interval look like, and what is your upgrade cycle?
Oh, gotcha. Generally, it's sort of the same way that we do with Windows, where we hold back a week or two, and just to check Reddit and make sure nothing's exploding. And then somebody, usually me, will either after hours or on a weekend pop in and do an APT update, APT disk upgrade. And that's like most of it. And it's only, a half dozen systems or something. Does that answer that question?
That's great. No, yeah, it's a good
Sounds like it
expansion
does,
on the
yeah.
question.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you have something like this presentation up as a YouTube video?
No, but
Super interesting, and I would love to be able to pause certain sections.
oh, really? Well, it seems like I'm being recorded. Is this going to be posted somewhere? Oh, okay. So,
No, where's it going to be posted?
OCRS.org.edu.
Okay.
Can we get the slide deck?
Yes. Yeah, it's in Canva, so I exported it and it was like 500 megs or something, so I'll get it. I use a lot of graphics. My other ones, I usually do animations and just make it obnoxious because I think it's hilarious. But yeah, I will get the slides posted as soon as I can.
And we posted slide decks in previous years as well. I'm not sure. I assume we're doing it again this year. I can't say it.
I got an email about that, so presumably, yeah. Oh, and if anybody has any questions about any of this or like wants to implement any of it, I should put my email up there. You can email me. How can I get this up here? What's the easiest way? Let's just do this. Can I click out of this, please? Yes, okay. Nope, to the left. There we go. That's my email. The world's longest domain. I'm slowly transitioning us to philomathsd.net instead of this guy. The students are student.philomath.k12.or.us, which for a third grader, when they transition from the QR code to the username and password, oh my, horrendous. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
What tool do you use for managing and patching your Linux stuff?
Oh, I do it manually. I'm going to be honest. Yeah. The Action 1 agent is coming soon, which should help with that. I'm so excited. It's going to be the best. Action 1, they're the agent that runs on the Action 1 agent is coming to Linux soon. And I've been talking to one of the developers back and forth, like, dude, put me in the alpha. Like, I'm here for it. Right? Anything else? Yes?
I think it's your school district staff-ish and building-ish wise.
We have 7 schools. One of them is a charter school that we only kind of manage. One of them has like 2 teachers, so it's like a remote school in Blodgett. And we have 1,700 students total and around 200 staff, maybe a little under 200, so relatively small, which is part of why we can afford to be this flexible and get away with all kinds of shenanigans, but it's been working, so. Anybody else? No? All right. Thank you.